I hope the series from Andy Stanley has been helpful to you. If you're just now tuning in, you can find both the printed version of the message and also a recorded version of the message on our website if you want to backtrack and catch up a little bit. Let's pick up this morning on a question that we got into toward the end of the message last week. And of course, it's a question that Andy Stanley poses, which I think is very, very relevant. And here's the question. How would someone in a situation of adversity act or respond if they were confident that God was with them? I mean, if they were confident with God was with them, even in adversity, would you expect to see some courage in them? Would you expect to see some patience working through the situation? Would you even expect to perhaps see a sense of gratitude for God being with them and having perhaps walked them through other situations in life before and now with them once again? And perhaps currently you are facing some significant struggle. And as you prepare to respond to that whatever it might be, perhaps you're also beginning to think of the choices, the options from which you'll choose. And as you think of those choices and options, do they reflect a sense in you that God is with you in what you're facing? Let's be honest, any of us could be facing a situation at times when we're at our worst. We would just wish God would turn his head away for a moment as we do what we think we ought to do. And when we have those moments, chances are we're not thinking that God is with us. We're just reacting out of our emotion and our pain. But also apply this question to even what's going on in our society today, the racial tension, the fallout from the pandemic, a lot of people still unemployed, all that has been going on. And as you think about, well, what can I do and how should I respond? If you believe God is with you and with us, then what kind of options begin to come before you to choose from? We are going to finish out the message today drawing from the final chapters of the book of Genesis and the portion of Joseph's story, and it involves chapters 39 through 50. And because in this part of the Joseph story, it just illustrates so well that if we trust God is with us, Joseph's actions should remind us of the direction our actions should be taking. Now we'll just kind of review briefly from last week and pick up at Genesis 39:9. You know, that's the passage where it was dealing with Joseph's response to the sexual advances by Potiphar's wife. In verse 39, or in chapter 39:9, Joseph finally says to her, after she's been tempting him, "How then could I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" How could I do this great wickedness and sin against God? And then if you remember the story, you know that Potiphar's wife kind of took a step back and said, "You're right, Joseph, you're much wiser than I am." No, instead she kept pursuing Joseph, and finally she kept pursuing Joseph to the point that she accused him of raping her. And then when her husband Potiphar was told about this, I mean, who's he going to believe? His wife or a slave? And Joseph is thrown into Pharaoh's prison. Now here's where Joseph's life stands at this point, or as Andy Stanley refers to it, as Joseph's resume. Joseph, betrayed by his brothers, sold twice into slavery, framed, and now thrown into prison. And now we pick up at Genesis 39, beginning at verse 21, and here's what it says. "But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love. He gave him favor in the sight of the jailer." And I know, especially when we're thinking about when we're going through adversity as well, you know, that part of the story seems hard to swallow, doesn't it? I mean, when we think that if we have God's favor and God's steadfast love, shouldn't something be happening where Joseph is getting out of jail instead of God just being with him in jail? And then the scripture continues. The chief jailer committed to Joseph's care all the prisoners who were in prison, and whatever was done there, he was the one, meaning Joseph, he was the one who did it. The chief jailer paid no heed to anything that was in Joseph's care, because the Lord was with him in whatever he did, and the Lord made it prosper. So Joseph trusted that God was with him, and it showed in his choices. It showed and how he responded. Even though he has been falsely accused, unfairly treated, and now he's in a dungeon, a prison, Joseph senses that God is with him. And other people are noticing as well that Joseph believes God is with him even in this time of adversity. Now, I do want to be careful to warn us not to romanticize this part of the story. He still is in prison, held against his will. But as the list grows of people who have betrayed him, and as the list grows of the setbacks that Joseph has experienced, the one constant is this: he trusts God is with him. And so that at least that part of his life that he can control. He can't control other people, and he can't control all circumstances. But at least what he can control, he's drawing on his trust in God to make the most and the best of it. I came across a quote that was attributed to legendary basketball coach John Wooden that said, "Don't focus on what you cannot change. Focus on the change you can make happen." And that seems to be Joseph's demeanor. Joseph made the best of his situation as he trusted God was with him. Maybe you have a list. Maybe you have a list of people who have hurt you. Maybe you have a list of situations and setbacks and disappointments that you're facing, and the list seems to be growing rather than shrinking. The Joseph story can remind us we still can make a choice in how we respond. And we can react strictly out of our emotion and our pain and hurt, or we can respond in such a way that we believe God is with us. Think about this. The most famous psalm in the Bible is Psalm 23. And here's one of those verses from that psalm. "Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil, for you are with me." That psalm is attributed to King David. King David chose to believe and do what Joseph chose to do and believe, and that is, no matter what he was facing, even the darkest valley, that God was with him. And then we shift gears here a little bit to Genesis 40, and it begins saying something like this: "Sometime after this." Genesis 40, the new chapter, opens up and says, "Sometime after this." And we don't know for sure just how much time had gone by. But then again, if you're in a prison, if you're in a dungeon, and you're there for an hour, that's more than enough time to have been there. And some time had passed by, and to Joseph it must have seemed like an eternity. And some time passes by, and if you're familiar with the story, you know what happens next. Two men land in prison with Joseph. They are men who were servants to Pharaoh, king of Egypt. One man was the cupbearer, meaning he tasted the wine before it was served to the king or Pharaoh to make sure it wasn't poisoned. The other man was the baker for Pharaoh. And most of you know the story how Joseph notices one day that both of these men are like downhearted, and he asks them about it, what's going on. And they begin to tell him that they both have had dreams, but they don't understand what the dreams mean. Listen to what Joseph said to both men. "Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me." And just think, more time has gone by with Joseph being in prison for something for a crime he didn't commit, and yet he still believes God is active and engaged in the affairs of this life. Joseph interpreted each man's dream. For the cupbearer, it was good news. He was going to get his old job back, where he would be before Pharaoh once again, serving him out of prison, where it's nice, clean, posh position. For the baker, not so much. It was bad news. And so the cupbearer was restored to his old position, but the baker was executed. And then, as you read through the story, it's like for most folks, maybe for you, maybe for me, like that last straw of pressure and discouragement seems to fall. Verse 23 from chapter 40 says, "Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him." Now, when Joseph had interpreted his dream and when he had told the cupbearer, hey, you're going to get your old job back, one thing Joseph did, he pleaded for him. He said, when you get before Pharaoh, tell him about me. I shouldn't be here. I was thrown into prison without having committed any crime. And so that plea to the cupbearer, it also tells us Joseph was desperate in some sense. He was still in pain in some sense. But the scripture says, even though the cupbearer probably said, yeah, Joseph, I'll tell him first thing, that the cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but he forgot him. Remember Andy Stanley's comment from last week when he said this? No one was looking for Joseph, and no one was looking out for Joseph. And he said, isn't that how a lot of people feel today? And once again, that type of pain must have hit. I mean, we know how the story of Joseph ends, but still there was that pain of being forgotten. We know how the story of Joseph ends, but there's this delay when there shouldn't have been. When he's been in prison long enough and his delay for being set free has been long enough. Isn't it, especially during the delay, that we can get desperate and we can make choices or reactions more out of our pain than good choices in a sense that God is with us? Because during the delay is when we especially try and tell ourselves this, or at least this message starts creeping in. During the delay, it's by now things should be different. By now things should be getting better. By now I've been going through this treatment and I should be feeling better. By now we've tried to do things in the relationship, maybe in a marriage, maybe with your children, maybe in your career, and things should be moving forward, but they're not. By now things in our society with the protests should be settling down. By now, things should be getting back to normal from the pandemic. But they're not. I mean, we're living in times when there are plenty of options to choose from, where the delay is there, and we can feel the pain of it, the pressure of it, and feel forgotten. Because delay tempts us not to trust God is with us. And delay tempts us to make choices that later on we're sure to regret. Well, 2 more years pass by, and an opportunity finally comes that will reveal whether or not Joseph still believes God is with him. And you know the story. Pharaoh himself has some disturbing dreams, and he doesn't know how to interpret them, and no one in his kingdom knows how to interpret them. And then suddenly the cupbearer has the light bulb go off, and oh yeah, I know someone, he knows how to interpret dreams. And so he remembers Joseph, he tells Pharaoh, and Joseph gets called up before Pharaoh. And here's what the scripture says. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have a dream, and there's no one who can interpret it. I've heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. And Joseph answered Pharaoh, it is not I. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. It is not I. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. And by his response, even 2 years later after being forgotten, Joseph still trusts that God is with him and can still help Pharaoh with his dream for it to be understood. And so you know the story. Joseph goes on to interpret the dream. Pharaoh had 2 dreams. One was a dream of that meant that there were going to be 7 years of a great harvest, plenty of crops. And then the other dream meant that there were going to be 7 years of famine. And so Joseph, interprets all this for Pharaoh. And Pharaoh is so impressed with Joseph, he realizes, Joseph, you ought to be the man to help us prepare for this. And so Joseph is put in charge, second in command over everyone in Egypt except for Pharaoh himself, and prepares Egypt for this famine. And he prepares so well that people, even from the region around Egypt, they come to Egypt for food. There is so much grain stored up from Joseph's leadership that people from the region around Egypt come there for help and for hope. And you know who else comes to Egypt from Canaan? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob's old neck of the woods, who come to Egypt for food. And that's Joseph's brothers, the very brothers who sold him into slavery. And many of you know the story. You know that when the brothers first show up and they're getting their food and they're paying for it, Joseph is present, and they don't even recognize who Joseph is. And finally, when Joseph knows, of course, who they are, he kind of toils with them a little bit. He plays with them a little bit, and he let's be honest, Joseph flirts. He flirts with really getting some revenge on his brother. He was tempted to want to return evil for evil. But finally, Joseph revealed himself to his brothers. And you can only imagine that when Joseph tells them who he is, how those 10 brothers must have swallowed hard. And how the sweat must have broken out on their foreheads when this happened. Here's what the scripture says. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come closer to me." And they came closer. And he said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life." Remember, these brothers, these are the men who are the forefathers of the 12 tribes of Israel. I mean, it's out of these men that people like King David will come. It's out of these men, I believe the tribe of Judah, that Jesus will come. And then fast forward a little bit later, Joseph has his brothers go back and get his father Jacob. And Jacob is brought to Egypt. And then for a while, Jacob and Joseph are reunited and all is good. But Jacob is way up in age. And then Jacob ultimately dies. And after Jacob's death, the brothers begin to wonder, is now when Joseph is going to drop the hammer of revenge on us. And Genesis 50 describes how the brothers come to Joseph and they plead for mercy. And they said to Joseph, "We are here to be your slaves." And here was Joseph's response. "Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Even though you intended harm to me, God intended it for good, in order to preserve a numerous people as he is doing today." God was working through this whole situation, not even just for the sake of Joseph, but for generations to come. Joseph believed God was with him and working for a greater future than just Joseph's. Joseph passed on revenge because all along he trusted God had taken this entire situation and was going to bring about his good, God's good. Andy Stanley says, the collective responses of Joseph were used by God. Catch that phrase. The collective responses or choices of Joseph were used by God. The collective responses of Joseph happened because Joseph believed God was with him. And so for you and for me, God's presence with us can help us take those moments. When on one hand we think we have every right to retaliate, we have every reason to be discouraged, we think our last hope is gone down defeat. But yet, if God is with us, we can be like Joseph and respond in such a way. With courage, with hope, with patience, with gratitude. Tomorrow in worship, since we're back live finally, looking forward to that, there's going to be a picture shown at this point in the message. And the picture is of the Memphis Tiger football team from 2007. And it's when they were going to be playing the Marshall team. And they come onto the field arm in arm. The coach is in the center, and there's like 2 or 3 players on each side, and row after players, all of them coming on to the team, arm in arm. And they did it for this reason. Many of you might know a player by the name of Taylor Bradford. He had been murdered just a few days before that game. And so the coach and the team came on the field, marched arm in arm, I'm sure thinking of him, thinking of winning this game in honor of him, being united as one in their grief and their loss. You know, that image of arm in arm, I think is how by faith Joseph made it through all those years, being rejected, sold into slavery, all that he went through. I think Joseph always saw himself like this, arm in arm with the presence of God, and nothing was going to wedge in between him and his faith in God. I think his decisions, his responses, were always linked to God's will. And our best way forward in any adversity that we face is to use our freedom, to use the ability to make our choices, but always see ourselves arm in arm with wanting to do God's will. Always see ourselves arm in arm with wanting to do God's will and make choices that we can look to the scripture, we can look to the example of Jesus and respond and choose, but not just react. Imagine facing difficulty arm in arm with God. And whatever you may be facing today, or whatever may be coming in the future, and whatever we may be facing as a society and a community together, just imagine facing it locked with God, arm in arm. I know this much, especially based on the Joseph story. When we come through it, when we come through the other side, we will be better for it. Let me have a word of prayer for us. Lord, help us to take this great story of Joseph, one that I doubt any of us ever get tired of hearing, because it's so true to life of what we go through. We all face our seasons of adversity. For some, it may feel like more than their share. But as we do, Lord, help us to remember the story of Joseph, and ultimately help us to remember Christ and the example he set, to always be one with you, to always choose to seek to do your will and not just ours. And if we do, doesn't mean it's always going to be a bed of roses. Doesn't always mean we win. But one thing for sure, in you, we will be better for it. Amen. God bless, and we hope to see you soon.